the promise, Zacharias' promise, and peace, prosperity, longevity, and posterity will be gone. The promise is a deity. The dagger hides within the sash, each serpentine curve of the blade, jewels adorn it, words march down the wavy blade.
I was once asked whether I felt any jealousy, being the second son of Zacharias. At the deepest level of my soul, I've always been grateful for my position as the keeper of the soul of Estolia. I understand the promises made to my father, and know each of those promises will be granted to all my father's descendants, willing to keep the promise he made to deity. My descendants will feel the fullness of those blessings, but have a greater freedom than those destined to be the fulcrum upon which the health, safety, and longevity of the nation is balanced. The sons of my brother, Zacharian. Amador, second son of Zacharias. Capitulo 1.
Tremaine nodded to both acolytes, glad he was no longer in his first 3 months, opening doors, doing menial tasks, and reading and copying the capitulos to new scrolls. He now appreciated the succession of learning that was the system within the temple. He spent a lot of time pondering how he might refine, change, and make the system even better. Crossing the first foyer, he was joined by several other senior acolytes making their way to the ceremony room. Rialto was sitting on the steps of the dais, waiting for the last of the acolytes to join him. Tremaine settled on one of the stone tiers around the room. He looked around, trying to determine which acolyte was still missing. After a minute it occurred to him that it was his brother who was missing. In that moment, Antiochus slipped into the room and crossed to sit by his brother. His face was flushed, embarrassed to be the one holding up this important discussion. Rialto nodded, and an elder stepped out of the ceremony room at each entrance. They would keep any acolyte who was not yet ready to hear what would be learned within from entering. Rialto looked around the room carefully before raising a hand to the black sash he wore.
Tremaine, what is the office of last resort?
Tremaine was conscious of the reality of his one day holding that office.
If Antiochus decides not to be king, then as the last resort, I am forced to take the crown.
His voice clearly demonstrated his disgust at the thought.
Have you spent no time thinking about the promise of Zacharias?
Rialto's voice was scathing in response to Tremaine's answer. Tremaine frowned and sat forward, trying to analyze where his error was. Perhaps he was flippant? He thought he had the kernel of truth that went with the role.
It is critical,
he said slowly, demonstrating he was putting full thought into his answer,
that the promise Zacharias made to deity is kept. Critical the heir to the throne wait until his 30th year to hand his soul into the keeping of his future wife, and then that he should marry her 7 days afterwards.
His eyes met those of his uncle.
The last resort's role is to be his brother's guide, to steer him from breaking the promise made to deity, to assure he meets and gives his soul to the right woman at the right time.
Or?
Rialto asked.
Or Estolia will fall if the promise is broken. The heir to the throne must keep the promise always. The last resort has the sacred duty of assuring it is not broken.
Rialto nodded, and Tremaine felt relief that he was able to put into words what he had learned. He would avoid flippant answers in the future.
Antiochus, what would constitute the breaking of the promise Zacharias made to deity?
The acolytes and elders in the room were riveted to this teaching moment. It was a spiritual gift to be an acolyte or an elder while the heir apparent or his last resort were in their acolyte year. To have them both there, simultaneously, was a double blessing. Antiochus was solemn.
If the heir apparent was in the habit of finding girls who were pure and taking their virtue prior to his 30th year, this would violate the spirit of Zacharias's promise.
In what other way might the heir violate the promise?
If he refused to give his soul into the keeping of the woman whose aura he clearly saw, he would be ignoring the dictates of deity.
That would be unlikely.
Rialto had the same expression the acolytes often discussed amongst themselves. The men of Estolia, once they found the keeper of their soul, were uniform in the way they discussed the allure of the woman who kept their soul and showed them her aura. Antiochus added,
The heir could also violate the promise if he gave his soul into the keeping of a woman, but refused to wed her, or if she refused him.
Rialto addressed one of the elders in the room.
What is the duty of the last resort if the heir apparent willfully defies the promise Zacharias made to deity?
Elder Garrison was not the most intelligent individual ever to grace the temple. He was slow to internalize and learn any lesson, but he was tenacious. He spent 3 years as an acolyte, and after marrying, he spent his time in the temple as an elder, in charge of the temple stables. He looked at Antiochus and Tremaine and then said, in his slow, thick voice,
"If the heir plans to break the promise, then the last resort must stop the heir before it can be broke."
What do you mean, Garrison?
Rialto pushed. Garrison's face visibly reddened.
He would try to make him keep the promise, but if he won't keep it, then the last resort becomes the heir.
How?
Rialto pushed harder, his expression intense, as if he knew that Garrison had more to say. Garrison stood up and went up to Rialto, falling to his knees in front of him.
I had a vision. One day the last resort will become the heir.
He dipped one of his clumsy hands into a pocket.
He used a dagger. When I helped create the second seclusion chamber, I found gems and stones I carried. I listened to deity and worked with my brother, and we made this dagger for the last resort.
The dagger he pulled out was ornate. The blade had a serpentine curve to it and sported a grip with a rich purple amethyst nestled between an array of emeralds. Garrison's brother was an expert at working metal and gems. Clearly the dagger was fit for royalty, or in this case, for a divine purpose. Rialto looked at the dagger with reverence.
Very few of those who study within the walls of the temple are as close to deity as you, Garrison, descendant of Amador.
He held both hands out, palms upward. Garrison smiled self-consciously before laying the dagger gently on Rialto's hands.
In your vision, Garrison, where did the last resort keep the dagger?
Rialto asked him.
The only place logical, over his heart, inside the sash.
Deity, speak to us.
Rialto said. He looked around at the gathered acolytes, his eyes glinting meaningfully. Tremaine stared at the dagger with a sense of sickness. He would never, could never envision taking his brother's life. He would as soon take his own life. He met his uncle's eyes. This was the true purpose of this meeting. His purpose, his office as the future last resort, was nowhere near as trivial as he made it out to be. It was serious, with implications he'd never considered. He swallowed down on the emotions clogging his throat. Clearly, he would have to be certain his brother kept the promise of Zacharias.
Stay true to your Katie, and teach your children to believe. Choose deity over other gods, and your people will blessed be. Keep the promise, Zacharias.